Welcome back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm excited to be joined by the founders of Arise. Amanda D'Ambra is formerly of Brightline and City Block. Joan Zhang is formerly of Headspace, and they collaborated to co-found Arise, a virtual eating disorder care startup. Arise recently announced a $4 million round with Greycroft, BBG, Wireframe, and the founders of City Block. So congratulations on all the progress so far, and I'm excited to have you on.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
So just to kick it off, I mean, a lot of the press releases around Arise and some of the work that you've done have called you both veterans in digital health. So I think it would be interesting to start there to maybe talk about, you both have come together from some pretty prominent digital health startups that are out there, maybe some of the lessons that you learned in working with these big companies, these founders who have kind of grown these large-scale startups, and then thinking about sort of care delivery and what's done well, what's not done well broadly in digital health, and then we can get deeper into the eating disorder space.
Yeah, absolutely. I can share a little bit of my perspective here to start. I mean, I feel very fortunate that I've had the privilege to be a part of such incredible businesses like City Block and Brightline and others from very early stages into growth. And I think there's been so much that I've learned from all the folks that I've worked with, the leaders, but also all the folks who are operational and doing all the work. But there's so much to learn in terms of different care delivery models, and I think the biggest thing for me was really deeply seeing how innovation in digital health is not just what's the fastest path from point A to point Z and the kind of point solutions, but rather how do we use innovation and technology to actually meaningfully improve how we think about care delivery, especially where we are talking about complex needs, and especially when we are looking to really support folks who have been overlooked or underserved, whether that is by the healthcare system or more generally speaking, culturally. So I think a lot of my time at City Block, Brightline, and these other companies has been really learning and applying to what we're thinking about with Arise, with how do we really build a model that is very comprehensive in terms of the end-to-end care delivery, and doing so for really diverse populations.
Yeah, and on my side, I've been so fortunate to just have worked at a number of different digital health companies. Started off at Lantern when the team was about 10 to 15 people as an intern. So still remember the San Francisco office and the tiny little workspace that we were in. And then was at a company called Click Therapeutics out in New York. And there I was just given so much responsibility, and it was so interesting how we were actually going through the most regulated process and actually going through clinical trials to demonstrate that an app could be effective in treating major depressive disorder. And I think that showed me the opportunity that we have with technology to actually create new forms of treatment. And then I still saw, though, the importance of having that human support, and that's why I ended up moving over to Ginger, which then merged with Headspace Health. And I was just so grateful. I think what I learned from Headspace and the team there, and really the leadership there, was the importance of being human, and both the power and vulnerability that comes from being fully human. I saw that at the team level, where because we were all coming to work happy, able to collaborate, it created just a different environment where folks were genuinely, rooting for one another and genuinely looking to collaborate and solve the same problem and run the same race together. And I think on a micro level, it allowed me to finally think about things in a really creative way, because I was able to just see kind of my own experiences reflected in our members' experiences. That ability to be human is also so centered to how we are thinking about building Arise. Because at the end of the day, if we want to deliver human, compassionate care, our team needs to know what it means to be human. We need to treat one another as humans.
That's very helpful. Can you talk a bit about, you just mentioned complex situations, specifically with the care that you guys are providing. Can you talk a bit about, I think there is a lack of understanding about eating disorders in the country, and maybe a bit about eating disorders holistically as a whole, and what the patient journey looks like right now. But on your website and the type of care you're delivering, you're also focused on those complex situations and the ones with dual diagnosis. So if they are dealing with the mental disorder as well, or mental illness too. Could you talk a bit about the patient that is dealing with this before we get into the care delivery or the specific product?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can even actually start with our experiences and journeys going through eating disorder treatment, and you'll be able to see how it's been so different for just the two of us. And I think we'll caveat that our experiences are an n size of two, and there's so many other broader experiences, and we come to this with our own levels of varying privilege. But for me, that journey started when I was going into my first year of college. Experienced a lot of family traumas, I would say, prior to that. Was in an environment where I went back to China and was part of a family reunion of 40 people, and was just surrounded by people who came and attacked my body in many ways, and commented and provided really derogatory comments about my body and how I looked. And it was quite deeply traumatizing. And at the time I was kind of told, well, they're family, so don't take it too seriously. But that sat with me. And I think it sat in a really deep way that wasn't just about how I looked. It kind of was a moment where I felt like I didn't have any more worth, and I had to constantly prove my worth. And at first that manifested in being really anxious about doing well in school, and, and then afterwards, I think once that had been passed, it still felt like I didn't have worth. And then it moved on to, how do I need to change my body and how I looked? And I was really fortunate that, once I got to a point that was really difficult, my parents finally recognized that challenge and recognized that I needed help, and did encourage me to go see a doctor. But for them, they didn't have any vocabulary around mental health or eating disorders, coming from China and not speaking the language very well. And so they just told me, go see the doctor, take care of it. And I was really fortunate. I found a really wonderful therapist on campus, and I had access to that. I had access to my parents' insurance. But ultimately, I think once the summer kind of came around, I didn't have that continuity of care. And it really led to a really long journey of kind of figuring out how to recover on my own, and actually quite literally studying the area and doing research. And even then, even as someone who studied the subject matter, even as someone who's worked in the mental health space, it was still so difficult for me to tell anyone that I was struggling with disordered eating, because there was such another layer of stigma around disordered eating and eating disorders.
And I have just continued to just have so much compassion and respect hearing Joan's every story every time I do. I recognize that I come from many levels of privilege, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, especially as we are talking about serving folks who have been historically underserved. And my own experiences, those certainly do ground me in this work. And that's really how Joan and I came together around this, is one, because we do have these deep experiences ourselves, but also because we recognize that it's everybody's story is different. Everybody's experiences are so different. Really quickly on mine, just to share, between us, the very different experiences we had. Mine with eating disorder. So I first started as OCD. Actually, I was diagnosed when I was 12, and then that led to into an eating disorder. I eventually got into a partial hospitalization program when it became pretty severe. Missed my first month of high school, told everybody I was writing a book. Obviously that never came to be published, but I share that because there's still, as Joan said, just so much stigma here. And I think unfortunately the realities are, for many people when they get into care, and that is not the case for most people, up to 90% of people are not getting care, but even when they do, they're often really harmful experiences. It's often not looking at the underlying reasons why this is happening. Like, eating disorders are not just a brain disorder. They're also very much psychosocial. They very much are tied into what's happened in someone's past and what's happening today. And so we necessarily need to look at all of those things. And with my own experiences, having had those negative experiences in my high school years, when I then got to a point in my 20s where I was very, very deep into an eating disorder again, and depression and suicidal thoughts and all that came alongside that, I did not want to get care. I didn't want to go anywhere near it because I had these really negative experiences. And so there are so many systemic barriers that folks face, especially those who hold marginalized identities, but that is true across many different facets. And so, for us, it was really about how do we come together to build a system of care that is going to meet people where they are, figuratively and literally, and be able to really build resonance with people so that they feel that they really are validated in their experiences with eating disorders and mental health, and that they can actually get support from us.
That's incredible that you both are building something that's so personal to you guys. And have you seen, I think when we take your stories and across the entire country, how is this evolving for the broad population? Like, they say that social media is making this worse, are there other factors that are contributing to the condition worsening over time? And I think as we get into a rise, also maybe touching a bit on you mentioned PHP, partial hospitalization program. So what the levels of care are that maybe different populations in different cities have access to right now, and how that's actually evolving.
Of course. I mean, look, eating disorders have always been such a prevalent thing that so many folks are experiencing, but it's not talked about. It's still so heavily stigmatized. Certainly social media, our cultural kind of all the factors that are playing out in, social situations, I think certainly exacerbates that. And also that's always been true, right? And so, yes, of course, social media makes it worse, but I think that this has always been here and we're just starting to really talk about it. And that is an important thing that we really feel that Arise can be a part of, is shifting how we think about what eating disorders, quote unquote, look like. It's been really, really harmful that we've kind of had this stereotype of a thin, white, cisgender, more affluent individual who's experiencing eating disorders, and in particular a woman. That is not the vast majority of people who are experiencing eating disorders. People of color, LGBTQIA folks, those who live in larger bodies, those who experience disabilities or who are neurodivergent. Like, there are so many communities that are experiencing eating disorders at rates that are as high or even higher than you see among that stereotypical population. And yet, unfortunately, the treatment, the resources, the funding have been largely allocated to that kind of narrower subset of the population. And so for us, it was really about how do we really come together and address, to your point, the kind of cultural context in which people are experiencing their eating disorders. What is the societal context in which all of this is happening? So you can't separate out those things. This isn't just something that is happening in somebody's mind. This is also so part and parcel with all those other factors that are going on, which is why the community care aspects of our model are so important if we're meaningfully going to be able to support people through all of those external and internal factors that are happening.
That's very helpful. And so you just mentioned two portions of kind of care delivery. So you have the community care and then some of this virtual side. Can you touch a bit more on when you both started concepting this and looking at the broad landscape of how digital health is addressing mental health broadly and destigmatizing some of those issues, and then now going into kind of specific verticals of it? What was being addressed by some of the larger players that have been well-funded already? And where were they falling flat, or maybe not, or maybe you just realized that there's different populations that aren't being served. But could you give us a sense of how you both came together to think about that 0 to 1 of launching this, and how care would be different?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have seen such an important wave shift in how we culturally talk about and address broader mental health needs, anxiety, depression, kind of those that many, many folks are experiencing. And I think digital health has certainly been a part of that wave shift. But unfortunately, I think, the realities of, you can go broader, you can go deep. And I think it has been challenging when you're going broad to serve folks across kind of those needs, to really go deep in areas that do require a lot of complexity and care coordination with multiple folks on the team, and addressing, social determinants of health, behavioral health, medical needs. This is a lot of my learnings from City Block, but there's so much complexity here that it's just a fundamentally different model when you're addressing something that does come with so many different factors. So again, I think it's so important what digital health companies have been doing in terms of the shift in mental health, more broadly speaking. And now is our opportunity to be able to then go do what we are doing in these areas that have so much unmet need, but that do require more complexity in the model.
Yeah, and one of the first things Amanda and I actually did was talk to patients and talk to other folks who are experiencing disordered eating, because at the end of the day, we have to create something that will meet their goals and help them. And so part of that meant doing a lot of studies and just learning and listening to folks' stories. What we found was that among particularly a BIPOC community, we found that the vast majority had never actually taken the step to seek clinical care. There was already a barrier to taking that first step, whether that was distrust of their existing kind of healthcare providers in their area, or the feeling that treatment is too overwhelming, or feeling like they're not sick enough. There were so many barriers that were in place that community was actually just a more natural starting point to help folks develop that trust, to gain that education so they can make informed decisions about their care once they do start clinical care, and also start to really develop the social connections and the skills and the strategies to manage this on their own. Because I think a lot of folks want to. I think everyone would love to be able to manage their condition on their own. But I think there's a certain point where you need that clinical care, and we want to also make sure that folks have that support and that network when they are ready for it.
I was just going to add to that. I mean, we've seen in other areas, like with substance use disorder, that peer and group support is really, really powerful, and it meaningfully drives towards clinical outcomes. So this is not just something that feels better in terms of the experience for the member. It also meaningfully impacts where they're going to go and their kind of healing journey, if you will, longer term. So we really believe that, as Joan said, it is absolutely necessary to being able to reach and engage and support folks and build that trust. But then as we continue on in the care, it actually means that we're able to have longer term improved outcomes.
About how care is delivered from some of the other technology players that are out there or some of the more traditional clinics. Can you talk a bit more about how Arise is going to specifically deliver care to these patients and how that will evolve over time, kind of as the startup continues to grow?
Yeah, as we said, eating disorders affect people of all identities and backgrounds, and so care cannot be one size fits all. So for us, it is about understanding what are all those factors that are contributing to somebody's eating disorder and what they're experiencing, and the clinical model reflecting that. So being able to get people to the right intervention with the right care team, and that means bringing together a care team that can support many different specialized populations, that also spans different care modalities, cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-informed approaches. Like there's many different things in here that are important and need to be tailored to that individual's unique needs.
Yeah, and to paint a picture or a story around this, I don't think that our model is necessarily something that's completely out of the ordinary, particularly like the physical health world. I really draw a lot of inspiration from my dad's cancer treatment experience, where when he's going in, he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. There are many medications, and some do better in clinical trials than others. But ultimately, the doctor is not looking at how do we just completely eradicate the cancer. They're also taking into consideration, well, what's your liver function like? What's your kidney function like? And how do we create the right balance of medications to actually help you have the best quality of life? And that's what we're really aiming to achieve. Is we want folks to get better, but what is that at the cost? And we really need to center the patient's goals, the patient's quality of life, to really have true, meaningful healing.
With the complex conditions that you're also dealing with, you're also tackling severe mental illness. You're also taking on many complex cases of disordered eating. There are also major supply shortages in the U.S. of clinicians and the types of care teams that can deliver that type of care that you're looking for. How do you all think about that, or has that not been a major problem for you all yet as you started?
It's certainly something that we're reaching as we think about scaling over time. One of our important kind of ways we address that is the care advocate team, in particular because of the importance of shared identities and experiences. This is a team where we can really build that and really bring on folks who have so many different backgrounds. I mean, it could be recovery coaches, it could be MSWs who have done, community-based work, but over time, much like City Block did actually with community health partners, you can hire folks from all different walks of life and then train them, on the particulars of working with folks with eating disorders and mental health needs. So that is one thing that is certainly really scalable over time. And when you think about, for us, we are starting with folks who have diagnosable eating disorders, clinical level of need, but over time, we are going to be building out our community care model to also support folks who have subclinical disordered eating so that we can prevent them from escalating up to that level of need. And those folks could benefit just from the community care model and don't necessarily need to see a therapist or other clinician.
That's helpful. And I guess one of the other questions that came up, and I saw you all announced it, so if you don't feel comfortable talking about it, please let me know, but you are starting with launching a beta program. So can you talk a bit about what your decision was around launching a beta, how you kind of are working with some of these trial patients, but it goes back to that product plan of where does then that go and evolve, and what's the future for Arise after that beta is completed?
Yeah, absolutely. We saw just through our user interviews and being in community with other patients that community aspect really came up over and over again. And so it became a really key part of how we thought about differentiating Arise and really centering community care and centering people's unique experiences. And so part of this beta is to really prove that out and to demonstrate that a couple of different things. I think first and foremost that potentially this community-based support through the care advocate and these small peer support groups, that we can actually move clinical outcomes forward. The second area being, can we actually increase access for folks who haven't been ready to actually get clinical care or experience very real barriers to clinical care? Can we actually get them to some type of support that is equally effective? And being able to demonstrate these things for payers to really start the conversation, I think this is probably one of our riskiest areas for us to tackle and get that payer buy-in. So doing this early allows us to start that narrative sooner rather than later. And then we're moving towards later in the year, having the full care launch that incorporates the clinical care in tandem.
And you can imagine, I mean, we go back to the point of scalability, but, you know, if we're able to really demonstrate, which we strongly believe that we can impact not only engagement, but also outcomes with community care alone, that will enable us to support folks with lower acuity needs that maybe don't need to be in a full clinical model.
And when you think about a product, I mean, it is a tech startup at the end of the day that is working on kind of finding patients and customers where they are. How do you think about the growth marketing of this, especially when there are, I mean, what are the channels that you use? What are the hacks that you use in order to let patients know that you exist in an effective way, especially when you are providing a solution like Joan, you mentioned about your experience in school, of you're providing them with a platform of finding you online where maybe they're less comfortable going and finding care in person. Can you talk a bit about patient recruitment and how that's evolving for you all?
For sure. I mean, you're going to get sick of us saying this, but the power of community. And I really mean that. Like, we already, you know, when we brought on our care advisory board of folks who've been really already doing the incredible work in the space to reach and engage folks, so much learnings from them in terms of, you know, what is actually the thing that's going to get somebody to actually engage in care, which, you know, we've talked about. But there's a lot of power to that word of mouth. And part of that has to come with breaking down stigma. And I see such parallels in the good work that folks have done in substance use disorder spaces, suicide prevention. I actually worked on suicide prevention for veterans for a number of years. And one of the things that we found to be incredibly powerful was when you can hear from people who have similar experiences to you that don't meet the incorrect stereotypes and who do look different, come from different backgrounds. You know, when you see and hear from people in that way, there's so much resonance and trust that comes from that it then makes you more likely to be ready to engage in care. And then that has downstream effects because then you start talking about that in your communities, and then your communities start talking about it from there. So we really believe that, you know, being able to have Arise come out as a brand and elevating those voices and experiences and sharing those stories is something that we really aim to do and think is going to unlock our ability to really get out there and reach many, many people who need care today.
I think the peer support and group support is incredibly important, and it's something that was traditionally done in person. I think you're bringing that more virtual now to patients where they are. And I understand you started in New York and Texas primarily with this pilot that you're working with. Can you share a bit more about what are the other things and other treatments that can be delivered virtually, and where maybe some limitations with the platform, or do those not exist anymore? Have you thought of replacements for kind of delivering the full care continuum to a patient wherever they are, so they can continue to live their life without having to go into PHP or another program as well?
Yeah, I think with that one, you know, we have seen just many studies come out across these different areas, certainly before the pandemic, but especially now, that virtual care and teletherapy, like these are more effective, or excuse me, as effective, if not more effective, in most cases. And we have even seen that to be true with eating disorder specific treatment and substance use disorder specific treatment. So we have seen increasingly that, this efficacy on the care models is really there for virtual models, and in fact, very much preferred for a lot of folks. And that's not just because of geographical access, although obviously that's an important factor. It's also that it means that you can reach folks who, maybe do have those kind of barriers that we talked about before, whether that's cultural or kind of how somebody kind of absorbs that and where that creates barriers to their seeking care. And so we can actually make it such that it feels safer. It makes it so that, they can explore care. They can start to experience this without having to take that really high barrier of like picking up the phone, calling a treatment center, trying to find care, and then actually having to go into care. And so, I think there's just major upside for our ability to deliver care. And it also, when it comes to the group and peer support, becomes really impactful because you can reach folks who are, people you wouldn't connect with normally just within your one geographical community. You can connect with people all over the country who have shared identities or experiences that are going to really resonate, so that when you come together around those shared experiences, you can really connect on those in a way that, if you're limited to geography, you might just not be able to reach those folks.
Yeah, and I think two points there. I think two of the benefits of having the virtual care model, one being privacy and the second being flexibility. I think with privacy, I remember going to my college campus, the health center on my college campus, and being in a room filled with my peers, and just this overwhelming sense of, oh my gosh, everyone's going to know that I have an eating disorder, and everyone's going to think that something's wrong with me, and all of these looming thoughts that actually made it really difficult for me to go each appointment, and ultimately was, I'm sure, a contributing reason to why I decided not to go back the subsequent semester. I think to the point on flexibility, I also remember feeling like this is another class that I have to be taking because I have to kind of go for an hour multiple times a week. And it was really difficult to balance. And so by allowing folks to kind of take this appointment in the comfort of their home and provide flexibility, we just allow them to fit this in their life a little bit more and carry that healing more longer term.
Yeah, it's such an important point. I mean, in my 20s, I was really, fixed on how do I build my career, and taking time off. I was very sick, and I did not take time off because it would have meant coming out of work. And that is true for a lot of folks. The ability to take time off of school, work, community, caring for your kids, whatever it is, it's just not realistic for a lot of people.
That's helpful. And I think another more contemporary question, given we're in kind of August 2022, we've seen a lot of mental health startups get funded in the last sort of year, 2 years, because of venture capital, or because maybe some of the founders cutting corners. The best practices haven't always been followed. I mean, we've seen Cerebral sort of go through that recently. When you all are now starting this company and you've been working in digital health for several years and sort of learned from the best founders how to do it the right way, how do you think about growth from the venture model standpoint in terms of we need to sustain growth and think about profitability and revenue and all of that, and serving more of the patients, but doing it responsibly? And how do you think other founders can learn from you in terms of doing it that way as well?
We have from the very beginning felt very strongly that sustainable growth and success for the business over time is going to come from intentionality around the decisions we make with prioritizing member experience and provider experience from the very beginning. The type of care that we are delivering, there are no shortcuts to this. There are ways to think about scalability, which we could certainly touch on, but shortcuts are not the answer here, right? We need to really prioritize how do we build a model that is going to best support folks, and is going to really be the right interventions that are going to work for their specific needs, as opposed to just kind of, very quickly going to what is the fastest solution, because that is not going to, be the thing that meaningfully improves people's ability ability to access care or their outcomes over time. So it was important to us that we also had that alignment with our investors, honestly. So that was a huge thing, that as we were going through the fundraising process, that we really made sure that we were asking those questions of our investors. And we were very fortunate that we have partners that believe in that intentionality as well.
Great. So I guess switching gears now, let's talk about scalability then. So how do you think about growing a platform like this across the country, serving across more states that all have different regulations on how care is delivered, different codes, and different patient needs? So I'm sure that's a very complex problem that you both are trying to solve.
Balance between at the earliest stage of like do things that don't scale so that you can really learn and get product market fit, and also think ahead to how do we put in place the things now with the infrastructure that are going to enable us to scale. So for example, one of the key things in our model is a care advocate role, and Joan can share more about the beta we're about to launch and what that looks like. But this care advocate role is, it's a workforce of folks who come from recovery coaching or broader behavioral health coaching, or also MSW, like social work, community-based settings. There are many, many, many of these folks in all different areas of the country. And we believe that that is one way that you can really scale this ability to deliver care that is socially and culturally competent, and that is around shared identities and experiences. And also they're structured to work in a way, and the workforce is scalable in a way that therapists, are not, given we know all know that the shortages in that space right now. So, I think part of it is thinking creatively about like, what does our workforce look like over time? It's about how do we streamline things in terms of, taking the model that works and then thinking about ways to make it more efficient, as opposed to just, what is like the simplest, fastest path.
I think another key thing that we're doing early on that I think is quite unique is focusing on user research and co-designing, both with patients and providers. I think, a lot of companies go towards getting something out as quickly as possible, whether it's actually addressing the problems that providers and patients are experiencing. And often when you scale, you start to see those pieces crumble. And obviously there's going to be a balance there, but by starting through with co-design with patients and providers, we understand better what their needs are. And we're actually creating a solution that solves their needs rather than, tries to put Band-Aids on in the meantime. So being really thoughtful and also learning from all of the experiences that we've had at our respective companies and how they've scaled, and learning from, what's worked and what the challenge has been. So I think we have both seen the good and the bad, and are applying that to how we're growing Rise.
In a responsible way, where marketing may be going through the roof, or sort of CACs are changing, or when the next funding might open up.
I mean, many different thoughts here,
that?
But is the intentionality and how we are going to grow, and what are we attuned to in terms of our, the milestones we're going to hit, which for us are, really, really getting right this intersection of community and clinical, building these care pathways and the tailored clinical interventions, and being able to really demonstrate outcomes. That for us means, can we reach and engage folks who have been less likely to get care, but who very much need care and are driving up spend, medical and behavioral health? Can we actually partner with payers, because we've been able to demonstrate those outcomes on the population that they have served? And are people getting better? It is not just reach and engagement, it's also outcomes. And that for us is not just looking at kind of singular measures, how do we actually look at the reduction on cognitive and behavioral symptoms? How do we look at the comorbidities like anxiety and depression and demonstrate that we're able to bring those down? How do we look at folks' like ability to manage chronic conditions that are oftentimes go hand in hand with eating disorders? So there's a lot here in terms of looking at like demonstrating meaningful outcomes for what we're doing. So I think that is one of the biggest things that we're really attuned to. And then also it is like our ability to reach and engage populations with a really awesome member experience.
Well, this was very helpful, and I appreciate your time and for all the efforts towards a very meaningful cause. So thank you.